Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back again to another episode of As I Live and Grieve. Thanks so much for joining us every week. Look at me just being so greedy as to think y'all are there every week, but I hope you are, or here and there. Whichever, I'm happy that you have tuned in today, because today we're going to talk about how grief can impact those who work in hospice. And a lot of it will just relate also to people who give care to a loved one with a terminal illness as well. With me today, I am so happy to have met Shelly Henry. Shelly, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm so happy and honored to be here.
Oh, great. Thank you. It's certainly my privilege. Before we get started with my questions, of which I always seem to have an abundance, would you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yes. So my name's Shelly Henry. I am a hospice nurse. Well, I've been a nurse probably about 32, 33 years, and I've been doing hospice for 22 years. And about 7 years ago, I got really concerned about the changes that I was seeing in hospice, about we're losing a lot of our experienced hospice nurses because the work is hard, and it just seems to get harder and harder over the years. It's long hours, very demanding, and I felt like we were losing a lot of our very experienced hospice caregivers. And I wanted to come up with a way to bring those nurses back into the field. So that's where I came up with the idea to start the Amity Group, which is a staffing company that is dedicated solely to hospice. And all of our nurses are nurses that have left the field and that are super experienced and they've left the field, and we bring them back and they come work for us, and they're able to set their own schedule with us. And then we just go in and staff for hospice companies. Just, if they need a nurse here and there, they have a nurse out for the day or on vacation, or, sudden growth spurt, and they need nurses to fill in until they can find the right nurse to hire, that kind of thing. So that's what we do. So a lot of flexibility. It's kind of an unusual business model for hospice. So we've been doing this for 7 years. And I love it. We have a wonderful team of nurses. We cover the South right now, and we're growing across the United States.
Well, I like that you're growing across the United States, because I'm in the northern part of the States.
Yeah.
And I know up here for us, nurses in general are hard to find. And nurses that want to work in the field of hospice are a definite rarity. Although from my perspective, I'm not a nurse, but from my perspective, to me, it's the perfect career choice for a nurse that maybe isn't quite as physically or mentally able to take that constant pounding demand of having a wing of residents in the hospital on acute care. This for me is something that is a little easier to manage. Up here, again, we have some comfort care homes that are hospice homes. They have only 2 residents. So to me, that would be a relatively comfortable shift to have just 2 residents to worry about and to focus on. Nonetheless, please consider putting a branch location up here, because
we definitely need it.
Yeah, we definitely need it. At any rate, nurses have always had a special place in my heart. Now, I appreciate doctors, and I know they go through a lot of training and everything, but nurses for me have the most one-on-one involvement with their patients. Mm-hmm. They seem to, most of them I've encountered anyway, really, really care about their patient and want their patient to do better. Yes. However, in the field of hospice, we know that it is likely, although some people do thrive in hospice, we know it is more likely that their illness is going to continue to progress once they're placed on hospice, and they're not going to get better. So that itself puts a different burden on that nurse. And when your career choice is to work in hospice, you are going to have one patient after another that is going to die.
Yes.
Now, I was always told when I grew up, one of the career choices I could have had, there's teacher, secretary, stay-at-home mom, or nurse.
Right.
It was suggested to me that I probably would not make a good nurse because I would not be able to detach myself. I would probably care too much about my patient. Mm-hmm. Yet I see dozens and dozens of nurses that exhibit that quality. So let me start with this question. If hospice is so difficult in that all your patients are going to die, what motivates someone like you, Shelley, to specialize in hospice?
So I hear that, I get this question a lot, I think, and we do know that our patients are going to die, and it can be very sad, but I don't find it sad. First of all, I don't really find death sad in and of itself for the person that's dying. The people that are left behind, definitely we miss the people when they die, but I don't find death itself sad. And as a hospice nurse, when I'm going to take care of a patient that I know is dying, I find comfort in the fact that I know that that person they're not going to be in pain. They are not going to be alone. They're going to have dignity. They're going to have control over where they die, what the end of their life is like, that they're going to have the very best quality of life, because that's what we focus on in hospice, not quantity, but quality. And so I know that if we're able to start taking care of that person soon enough, that we're able to manage that and have what we call a good death in hospice. And there is really nothing more beautiful than someone who has a good death when they transition from this earth in a very peaceful manner. It's a very beautiful experience.
Your words are very eloquent, and I appreciate them so much. I agree and echo your words of the good death. My mother, who died in a nursing home, and that was not what she wanted, but her dementia had progressed, so she wasn't really aware where she was. I wasn't with her when she died because she was in the facility. I got a call from the nurse about 5:30 in the morning saying that they felt her death was imminent, and if I wanted to be with her, I should get on my way. By the time I got there, they had already called me back on my cell phone and said that she had passed. And I thought, well, that kind of fits my mom's character. She wouldn't have wanted me there because she knew I was terrified of death at the time. It was hard for me to even utter the word death. And, I would use the word that she passed away, anything I could to avoid the word death. When my husband was terminally ill, and he died almost 6 years ago now, I was with him when he took his last breath. I had overcome my fear of death for many reasons, but I remember being perched on the side of the bed and just talking to him, because I had been made aware that sometimes hearing is the last of the senses.
Yes.
To go away as someone dies. So I was talking to him, and his breathing, of course, was ragged. It was that, I think they call it death rattle. It was very gurgly. And I knew his death was imminent. Nonetheless, I kept chattering away. I think they made the doll Chatty Cathy after me. But then I realized all of a sudden he had taken his last breath. And I went and got the nurses, and they came in and pronounced him. It wasn't until I was driving home a little later that day that it occurred to me that he would always tease me when we argued about having to have the last word.
Yeah.
And when I think of him dying now, I don't think of the sadness. I think of how he probably, as he was dying, probably one of his last thoughts was, I told you, you always get the last word, because I was just chattering away until he took his last breath.
Yeah.
So, but because of the facility he was in, the nurses, the staff that were taking care of him, and the staff that were also taking care of me, which was a vital part of it, I'm able to remember the exact moment of his death. I'm able to remember his last breath with a smile on my face.
Yes. See, that's so important. That's so important. That's why we do what we do.
Yeah. So there it is right there. But another component of that I just mentioned is, in hospice, yes, they're taking care of the resident. They're treating them with dignity and respect. They're honoring their last wishes to the best of their ability. They are keeping them pain-free and as comfortable as possible. But I was also taken care of. Can you describe to me that component of hospice and why it's so important?
Yes. So in hospice, taking care of the family is as important as taking care of the patient. So that's the whole model of hospice, is we provide holistic care to the patient and the family. So I will start, like from day one, I start preparing the family for what's coming. And so what could happen, what might not happen, I cover everything, and I talk about it a lot. And I tend to be very frank in my talking. Like you said, we talk about passed away and things like that. I try to use real words, and I always tell my families that I'm going to be honest with you always. even though it's something I think you may not want to hear, I won't sugarcoat anything. I'll be as gentle as I possibly can, but everything I tell you is going to be honest, because you need to be prepared and you need to know what's happening, just so that, like you just said, so that you know that you can be there and be comfortable with what's going on, so that you do have a good memory of what happened versus what could happen if we don't know and if we're not aware. And sometimes we really don't know when someone's going to pass. As a hospice nurse for all these years, most of the time I have a pretty good idea, but not always. So we start that preparation early on in the process, and we're there to support the family. Every time I go to visit a patient, the last 10 or 15 minutes of my visit, and like the way we do the nursing, we go from home to home to home all day long. So like the last part of my visit, I spend 10 or 15 minutes with the caregiver, and we go sit down in a separate room, and I just let the caregiver talk about, how are you doing? Because it's hard being a caregiver. You know, everything is focused on the patient, and nobody really ever says, hey, how are you doing? Because you're going through a lot. You're grieving the anticipated loss of the patient. You're grieving the loss and the change of your life and what's going on with your life, but you don't really get to voice that. So I spend time with the caregivers and let them talk about that. And we talk out their feelings, and to help make things transition more as the patient transitions also.
Yeah. And I think that was critical for me. I did experience that a little bit with my mother, but my situation there was a little different in that I also worked at the nursing home she was a resident in. So I had access to everyone there, not just hospice. And they were always so supportive of me. With my husband, they were wonderful. Even, as it got to be his last days, they would bring in a cart into the room with refreshments, with coffee, with water, with tea, with snacks, with everything, so that I could spend every moment I wanted to with my husband, or any visitors he had could also be there, be comfortable. He was in a semi-private room, and they were able for the last week of his life to not put anyone in the next bed.
That's
so we
so
had
good.
that space to ourselves. They are just, well, anyone that uses the hospice philosophy or anything that resembles it, and I think there are a couple other models as well, but they have chosen that approach, yes, to help the patient who's dying, but primarily I think their focus is the family, because they know the family, the loved ones, have to go on beyond that. And grief is not a trivial step in your life.
It's not. And I could tell you so many stories about family members, but I had one, if we have time for one quick story.
I was just going to ask you to tell me a story that is in your heart.
I had a patient one time, this was many years ago, and the patient had Alzheimer's, and she was very in stage at this point. They lived at home. She lived at home with her husband, where he was the caregiver. And she was pretty much not all the way comatose, but for the most part, she was completely bedbound and dependent. She really didn't wake up and talk or anything anymore. But every day at about 4:25, 4:30, the office would call me and tell me that Miss So-and-so, husband called, she's agitated, she's getting out of the bed, he needs you to go help. And I would go over there, and I'd get to the house, and she would be in her same almost vegetative state. And after a few times of this, I thought, I don't know what's going on here, because she's fine. He's anxious though. There's something going on with him. So one day, and he came from that generation too, where they don't talk about feelings, the World War II and all that, they just wouldn't. So one day it was almost 5:00, and I said, can I just sit down? The traffic's bad. Do you mind if I wait out the traffic for a little while? So I sat down, and he made a lemonade, and he made him a little drink, and we were watching the news. We started watching the news, and he starts talking and telling me the story of his wife. And, long story short, it comes out they had been married for like 60 something years. And every single day they sat down at 5:00 and they watched the news, and they had a highball. That's what he called it. They would have a highball every day for 65 years. Like, I'm about to cry talking about it. Mm-hmm. And so that was what was going on. Every day at about 4:30, that grief was hitting him, because she wasn't there with him.
Yeah.
So what we started doing, I let everybody at the agency know. So when I could, every day I would rearrange my schedule. And so every day I would go just end my day at his house, and I'd sit with him and we'd watch the news, and I'd drink lemonade and he'd have his highball and we'd watch the news. And then if I couldn't do it, when the CNAs would do it, social workers, the chaplains, somebody would go sit with him every day. And we did this for probably 3 or 4 months after his wife passed away. We would still go to his house and watch the news with him until actually he moved and went to live with his daughter. But we stayed there with him every single day.
Yeah.
And so,
and that's proof positive why not only nurses are so special, because you recognize that and you made it a point to identify what the problem was.
Yes.
Why there was an issue. But that's also why hospice is so special. I know at one of our comfort care homes, we had a lady come in, and her passion in life was sailing. The workers got together, and one of them had a sailboat, and some of them just volunteered. And one afternoon, they bundled her up, they took her out, they got her in the sailboat, and they took her for a final sail with some of her family. And we have pictures of that. And, the smile on this woman's face, talk about that commercial that says priceless. It absolutely was. So not only did she get to experience that one more time in her life, but her family has such a wonderful memory of her in her last few weeks before dying. And those moments are so special, and they're not going to happen without hospice and nurses. Or nurses. Right. They're just not, because no one else is going to take the time. So that's my declaration. Can we kind of segue for a moment to children? Now, I grew up with my parents my parents were of the highball generation. So when you mentioned that, that's exactly every afternoon, 5:00, both my parents worked, and my dad would get home a little after 5, and he and mom would stand in the kitchen. Dad would make the highballs, and they would stand there and talk about their days at work and catch each other up on gossip at the office, all that water cooler talk. And I remember sitting there listening to them with, I don't know, a glass of water, whatever they would allow me to have. As I came into my teenage years, I think I got a glass of wine, maybe. At any rate, we didn't talk about death. And if there was calling hours at the funeral home, it was more likely that my mother would tell me to stay home. So that certainly didn't help how I felt about death and the word death. Now, things are a bit different. Death and grief are becoming a more common topic to talk about. There are podcasts trending, many on grief. There are dozens more books available on grief, dealing with it, coping with it. So my thoughts turn to children and how to best prepare them. In the field of hospice and with nursing, if you're faced with family members and there are some children, do you help in that vein at all, and how?
Absolutely. And these are young mothers are the hardest for me to take care of. So difficult. I just can't imagine the grief and what the patient goes through, the young mother, the guilt and the things that they go through, knowing that they're leaving their children. And they have no control. It's not their fault. I mean, but it's really difficult. I spend lots of time with those children. So I usually schedule those visits for about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. Even if the patient doesn't really have a lot of physical needs, I know I'm going to spend a lot of time with the children. When I go in the door, I'll sit down first and talk with the kids and let them touch all my stuff and ask me whatever questions they want to ask me. If they stay in the room, which I do encourage, unless they're, if we're not doing any type of extensive medical care, but if we're just doing general stuff, I encourage that they stay in the room, let them ask questions, let them see that we're not hurting the patient, your mom or your dad or grandma or whoever it is we're taking care of, that what we're doing is, helping. And I answer all of their questions, because it is, we don't really know how children perceive things, because they don't communicate as well. They don't have the words that we have yet. So I like to make sure I understand what they're seeing, and if they're seeing something as scary, like the oxygen, that could look like that's strangling the patient or making it hard for them to breathe. I'll let them feel the oxygen coming out of it, the air coming out of it, and help them to understand that this is making mama more comfortable. This is helping mama. And so all of those things. So we spend a lot of time with that. If the family is open about talking about death and that stuff, and the child asks questions about it, I will definitely bring it on. We do want to respect the family's wishes. Right. And so it depends on they're going to kind of guide us in how we talk about that as well. Okay.
That sounds great. And I know, again, in my own family, I had repeated what my parents did when my 2 daughters, I was a single mom, when my 2 daughters were young and I had to go to calling hours, I arranged so they could stay home and had someone stay with them. And didn't come to my attention until doing a podcast, and my daughter Stephanie was co-hosting that day with me, and she made a comment how she didn't go to her first calling hours until she was 21 and was not terrified, but was quite anxious about it because she didn't know what to expect. And then it occurred to me, oh, wait a minute, something needs to be changed. So she, of course, realized that as well. And with her own boys, when my husband was ill, he was their step grandpa. She was very honest with them. And when they would come to visit, she was very clear with them what was going on and everything. And the impact it had on those boys was amazing. My youngest grandson in 6th grade did his final project on Agent Orange, which was responsible for the tumor my husband had, did it on Agent Orange and how it impacted my husband. And in front of all the parents and everything, tears streaming down his face. But he was able to do that as a 6th grade boy. I was so proud of him and of my daughter for realizing that there was a need to change things. Okay, one more segue. Hospice is tough. Nursing is tough. We talk about self-care and grief. How can nurses possibly help themselves cope with grief after grief after grief from residents that die?
Yes. So we're not doing a good job of that. We're not doing a good job of this at all. This is not even talked about. That's why I'm so excited, and I'm hopeful that to be on your show, we're going to start having these conversations because we need to. You know, back in the day, I've been a hospice nurse for 22 years, and way back when I first started, we have what's called IDT meetings, or interdisciplinary group meetings, where we meet at least every 14 days, the whole team, the nurses, social workers, chaplains, doctor, administrator, everybody meets, and we talk about all of our patients. And used to be back in the day when our caseloads were much lower and it wasn't as competitive and we weren't as busy, we were also able to, we would talk about the patients that died. Purposefully. We would pray with them and whatever, talk about our memories with them. We were able to debrief somewhat and express our grief and our loss. But over the years, that has really, the IDG meetings have become very fast. A lot of times they're over the phone. There is no talk.
Right.
So what's happening is, we take care of patients. We get very close with our patients. I may go see this same patient 3 times a week to every single day, sometimes for a year and a half, 2 years. I know the patient, I know the family. Suddenly they're gone, and I just have another patient that takes their place. Like there's no even time to can I have a day to let me just grieve? I mean, it's hard. And, we get really close to our patients. They become a part of our family, and suddenly I'm just not going there anymore. I'm just not driving down that road anymore. I don't get to see the family. Gotten close, even their pets and stuff. I'll miss the dogs and the cats and the horses and all of the things. And it's really sad. And I don't really know what the answer is. I've done some videos on it. I do tips for hospice nurses, and I put some stuff out there to what can we do? How can we address this? Because we're going to need to. I think it's going to catch up with us if we don't.
I would agree. Are there any changes that have been notable since COVID in that aspect?
If anything, I think it's gotten harder. I think that we lost a lot of nurses in COVID, maybe not to COVID, but out of the field completely. And so our caseloads have gotten higher. And so the time is even shorter.
Right.
So I think it's probably just gotten worse, not better.
And are you finding that people are being signed on to hospice seem to be closer to death or more acute, more terminal than before COVID?
No, I don't. I haven't noticed a difference down here.
Okay.
Probably about the same.
Okay. All right. The reason I mentioned that is, again, here and I'm in the Rochester, New York area, it has been notable for the comfort care homes that I work with that prior to COVID, we might have taken a resident. And for our comfort care homes, their prognosis needs to be 3 months or less. With hospice, it's 6 months. But so 3 months or less. And we had people that would stay the 3 months and still be doing well enough that they may have had to move back home or something like that. That was something that happened, well, not frequently, but would happen occasionally. Now, people, sometimes they come into the home, they get admitted one day, and they're gone the next. It is just so quick. So the general sense here is that either people aren't being signed on hospice early enough, or they are not getting to the point where family decides that they're no longer able to care for them. We haven't really been able to put our finger on it, but it seems that they're not coming into the comfort care homes until they're very, very close to their death.
That's interesting.
Which in some ways, some ways complicates that level of grief for our caregivers, our volunteers and our nurses and our CNAs, because they are turning people over so quickly. I know in the one comfort care home between, I think it was within a 6-month period. And these are 2-bed residences. So just 2 residents at a time. And we call them residents because we want them to feel that they live there. That's their home. Mm-hmm. But they, I believe in that 6-month period, cared for almost 60 residents. That's a lot of people.
A lot
to lose. And these residents do become your loved ones. You do as a caregiver. You love them. Yeah. You become close enough to them. So it is very, very difficult. We all need to put our collective heads together, I think, and decide what we can do about this. I know, again, in the comfort care homes up here, just the way the model functions, some of our directors will opt that if it happens that both beds are empty at the same time, of course, they have to go look for referrals and everything. So there will be maybe a 2 or 3 day period sometimes where there's no one in the house. And that does give the caregivers a bit of a break. And it is helpful. But at the same time, as soon as the announcement goes out that someone is coming in, someone's being admitted, the caregivers pretty much are flocking to fill those shifts because this career, this field is so vital to them. They're so passionate about helping people in this manner. It's an amazing thing to watch. If, like, I'm more in the administrative capacity, so it's really mind-boggling to me to kind of stand back a little bit and just see how these people, many of them volunteers again, are giving so much of themselves for this endeavor. It's a beautiful thing to see. And the way that they interact with family and the way they interact with the residents, caring for them, just spending time with them. It's not a job for any of them. It's a passion. And I love them all dearly for it.
It definitely is. It definitely is. And it's so hard whenever you do have that high turnover, because if you lose a patient, you don't really have time to even honor their life.
Right.
Or consider your feelings before there's somebody else in the bed and we got to start the process over again. And it's a difficult thing to do. And we need to figure out something to help our healthcare providers.
I would agree. I would agree with that. Well, time is winding down, Shelley. I always hate this part. But what I want to do before I actually wrap up is I want to turn the microphone over to you for a minute and just let you either express something to our listeners or tell them more about yourself, tell them how they can reach you, and tell them maybe what areas of the country you are in case there's anyone out there who may be a nurse who says, let me go check this out. The microphone is yours.
Well, thank you. First thing I'd like to say to any family members that are taking, and hospice patients as well, anyone on hospice, that, as the nurses, we do care so deeply for our patients. And these days we're so busy that sometimes we're having to so quickly go from one patient to another that we don't always get to spend the time that we want to be there with you, but it doesn't mean that we don't care. And it doesn't mean that we don't want to be there. And we're working on trying to figure out how we can do all of this better. I just think it's important that everybody knows that on those days when we are super rushed, we still do care very deeply about what we're doing. But as far as for my company's called the Amity Group, and you can go to our website. It's amitystaffing.com. That's AMITY staffing.com. If you are a hospice nurse right now we are in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, parts of Texas, and we are growing across the country. We are growing slowly on purpose because I want to make sure that we maintain the quality. And we use nurses that have left the field of hospice because they've gotten burnout, because you're tired. If you want to come back into the field and have control over your schedule, come check us out. Give us a call. I also designed a lot of products that are just for people who provide care in the home. So there's some things there that you can see that might be helpful for you in your job. And also, if you're out there and you have any ideas on what we can do as a profession to solve our grieving issues, to address these issues. I'm definitely open to hearing whatever your ideas are and doing what we can to facilitate something to help us through that.
That sounds great. As always, Shelley's contact information and notes about the podcast will be posted on every podcast app. And I do hope that you will consider for a moment, if you are a nurse, that you will consider for a moment checking out Amity Group. There is a huge need in this area of hospice. I can't say it enough. There is everywhere in the country. Nurses they're in short supply right now for many reasons. Some of it generational, they've aged out. Some of them, they just can't tolerate that acute care environment anymore. It's very demanding physically and mentally on nurses in general. Again, nurses are my favorite people. I secretly tell my nurse friends that I have a secret list that my daughter has, and it's a list of all the nurses I would like to rally when I am diagnosed with a terminal illness. And it's all of the nurses I would love to take care of me in my last days. Yeah. And they've been handpicked.
Mm-hmm.
I will continue also to think of ways that debriefing, any type of special things that can be done. I encourage anyone out there that has a contact with a pharmaceutical company, a medical supply company, anything like that, to take a few of those budget dollars you've got from your profits and maybe host a special retreat for hospice nurses.
Idea. I like that idea.
You like that one? Okay. Yeah. So maybe we can mull that one over and maybe do something in that vein, because it would be so appreciated and it is so needed. Yeah. And to those companies, not for nothing, but wouldn't that be a nice news story? So much better. So much better. At any rate, time is of the essence now. I must go. And so must Shelley, because we have busy schedules. Please remember to take care of yourself as you're taking care of others. Grief is different. It's unique. Every instance is different. So self-care becomes a primary task. And there are many ways to do that, including tuning into these podcasts and just hanging with the right people. So make sure you take care of yourself and come back and listen next time as we all continue to live and grieve.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. Do you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or do you have a question from one of our episodes? Please email us at info@asiliveandgrieve.com and let us know. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.